Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Wow, so serious. Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review episode for March 19th, 2023. I am Brendan Cassidy.
And I'm Jay Ledbetter.
Thanks for joining us this week, everyone, for our review of Shazam! Fury of the Gods. I feel like we have to say it like that every time.
You gotta add that exclamation point. It's there. That's how they want you to say it.
I mean, grammar is grammar. That's essentially what it's doing. It's basically a sentence, or it's like an end of a sentence and then a first half of another sentence without an exclamation at the end. So that's how we have to say it. But yes, we will be talking about the next film in the, I guess, concluding DCEU.
Yeah, the trailing off of the fumes of the DCEU.
Yeah, we'll talk about that as far as how this film feels with regard to the finality that we're sensing with this DCEU as we transition to the new James Gunn, Peter Safran-led DCU, as it's being dubbed. And there is stuff we can talk about as if this movie is maybe a little bit self-aware of that notion, for better or for worse. Maybe we'll talk about some of those things. But either way, Jay, I'm glad to see that you took some time out of your own schedule, which includes daddy duties, to go see a superhero movie.
Yeah.
We joked about this offline. Not normally a movie you might flock to the theater for, but I'm glad you took the plunge so we can at least offer some thoughts on this popular movie from this weekend.
Yeah, this is JD's greatest revenge, was on the first week that he is out for not being able to review a film. I am now doing Shazam, and he is, again, as we mentioned on the main show, he's at home watching Dog Day Afternoon, which is more my speed generally. But it is very funny that the first time I'm here, sans JD, is for a superhero film. Maybe a little bit funnier if it had been an MCU film. But DC will do the trick in a pinch.
Well, you've been a fan of some of these movies in the DCEU.
I have been, yes.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that. I feel like that'll be a great way to open up this conversation as we lead into this specific film, Shazam! Fury of the Gods. Before we get into this new Shazam film, the sequel to the 2019 film, also called Shazam, I guess let's first talk about maybe some of our favorite films from this DCEU that is slowly concluding, and then give some quick thoughts on that first Shazam, which also starred Zachary Levi. So, Jay, you're obviously an Aquaman stan. I feel like that's the best.
I'm an Aqua boy, 100% Aqua boy. And I think that movie is kind of indicative of what I have liked about the DCEU, as messy as it has been at times, as opposed to the MCU. The MCU, not to relitigate the stuff, we had one of our worst podcasts of all time talking about the MCU recently, but the MCU is a well-oiled machine. They churn out their content control, their quality control is out of this world good. It is just consistent. Like, we're going to give you this. It's going to be pretty much this good every time, and that's what it's going to be. Meanwhile, the DCEU, or whatever they want you to call it, they kind of take a little bit more of an auteurist approach, where they say, for instance, David Sandberg, you're kind of a horror guy. Let's let you throw in a little bit of that in your film and kind of make it your own to some extent or another. Yeah. And that's not even to talk about, the Jokers or the Matt Reeves Batman, which are kind of outside of the scope of what we're going to be talking about.
Yep.
But
Other Worlds, I think they're calling it now, or something like that.
Whatever.
Yeah, I don't.
It's all very confusing.
That. Yeah, it really is.
But I'm not as concerned with the connectivity. I'm just like, make a good movie. And DC has kind of, even within the greater DC universe, they've kind of just been doing their own thing. Like, it started out with Zack Snyder was the grand architect of the DCEU. And those films were largely not successful. So they took a new approach. They said, all right, let's not try to be Marvel. Let's try to do our own thing a little bit. Let's let James Wan go a little buck wild with Aquaman. And that is a huge, crazy, unique fantasy film, really, is what that ends up being. And I really, really enjoyed that film. And then I don't even know if the Suicide Squad, the James Gunn Suicide Squad, is part of the DCEU, but that film, clearly they said, James Gunn, go make a James Gunn movie. And then now he's in charge of all of this, so expect, I guess, more of that sensibility as far as
maybe. I mean,
the Suicide Squad is concerned.
We did find out James Gunn is officially directing, I guess, Superman Legacy, the
next Superman movie.
Yeah, which is meant to depict a younger Clark Kent / Superman. So maybe it might have a little more, I don't know if sincerity is the right word, but maybe a bit more of a childlike nature to it, which might be a nice change of pace for someone like James Gunn, who's all about subverting, using gratuitous violence sometimes, at least in the Suicide
Squad. Yeah. Obviously not in Guardians, which are my favorite.
MCU those
films,
are really good movies as well. You mentioned about how the DCEU for a little while there became less concerned with connectivity and more concerned with just making really interesting movies. And there was a small part there, like maybe 5 or 6 films in a row, where they were focusing more on the individual film itself and just how strange and fun that it could be. And I think Aquaman from James Wan is probably the best example of that. It's also my favorite film from this DCEU. And say what you will about Wonder Woman 1984.
I kind of liked that movie.
I kind of love it.
Liked that movie.
I kind of love it. I love the first Wonder Woman as well. That's more of a controlled film. I think it mostly falls apart in the final act for reasons we don't have to get into here. But Wonder Woman 1984 is a movie that clearly Patty Jenkins wanted to make. And you can argue maybe she didn't do a very good job with it, but it kind of works.
It's weird.
But it kind of works better because of what came before and after it, I guess, and I think that's what certainly supports it.
You could also throw in Birds of Prey in there too as a pretty unique superhero movie. Not a film I find entirely successful by any stretch.
No, but I'm liking that one.
For
I'm
sure.
liking that one more as time goes on. There are components there that I still remember. I've only seen the movie once, but there are things about that movie I haven't forgotten, which I mean, I guess that's a testament to the film doing something right.
It stands out in a world of, factory-made superhero movies. Again, we don't have to relitigate this again, but I don't think it's a secret or an uncommon opinion to hold that these are getting a little repetitive, a little whatever the opposite of a tourist is. That they're getting a little stale in some ways. And so it is nice to go back and think about, well, Birds of Prey had kind of this aesthetic that we're not really used to seeing, and some action set pieces that were going for something, even if they weren't entirely successful. And I appreciate that for sure.
And you mentioned David F. Sandberg, who comes from a more horror background, which included Lights Out, I believe, which I actually thought was a pretty effective horror film. And he, of course, directed Shazam from 2019. So before we get into our thoughts on its sequel, Fury of the Gods, what did you think about that first Shazam?
I think it's mediocre. I know for many people it was kind of this breath of fresh air, kind of the same way that we're talking about with some of these other films, but people were like, oh, it's kind of stripped back, it's smaller scale, it's going for a certain amount of charm, which I did appreciate about it. And it's one of those rare films where the origin story is actually the strength of the movie, because we've seen those things 1,000 times. But what separated Shazam was that it was these teenage kids, instead of just realizing they have powers, they literally, I mean, as far as it's how they turn into superheroes in the film, it's just really the snap of a finger and all of a sudden they're a superhero. They don't really have to learn anything about it. It's just these teenagers that all of a sudden, big style, like Tom Hanks' big style, are turned into this superhuman, extraordinarily handsome, powerful being. And not only do they use those powers for good, but part of what they want to do is be an adult and buy beer. Like it's pretty charming. There is a charm to that. It, I think, succumbs to many of the worst tendencies in the end that these movies have, but there is a little bit of that Sandberg horror to the film. I think specifically about that scene in the first film in the conference room, I believe, where they have these monsters. And it's pretty scary and harrowing and violent. And there's definitely some of that in the second film as well, Fury of the Gods. But overall, I don't really like Zachary Levi as a movie star. I gotta say, I wasn't totally sold on him in the first film. And obviously that's a huge component of what's going on. But I did think he did, for the most part, earlier on in the film, when he's really trying to act like a teenager, I thought he's pretty successful in that regard. But overall, that movie didn't really work for me. But it's in the... Sadly, I think it's in the top half of DCEU movies, whatever that's worth.
I think I might have it like number 6 out of what, maybe 11, 12 movies,
10,
whatever the number
10, 11, 12, something along those lines.
Yeah, something like that. So it means it is technically one of the better ones, but I'm kind of with you. I'm mixed to positive on the film. I think I like it more in theory than I do in execution.
I agree with that 100%. Yeah.
I think, the idea of it being almost like this 80s movie of sorts, when it really functions as more of a superhero situational comedy, I think it's really interesting, and I think it has a really interesting approach that it's trying to go after. It is pretty inconsistent in that regard. I kind of like Zachary Levi as a performer. I think he's charming. I actually love him in Tangled, the voice actor there for Flynn Rider. I think he's really charming there. The problem with Shazam is that I felt like there was very little synergy between what he was doing and what Asher Angel was doing as Billy Batson, the actual young version.
Yeah.
That I felt like there were two different characters happening here. And that didn't really work for me in that regard. And then when the film has to take a step back and actually be a superhero movie, it feels more obligatory given the freshness of its overall agenda. And I love Mark Strong, but I didn't necessarily love that character there, despite the more horrific flourishes of, let's say, that boardroom scene, which is very frightening. It's kind of surprising how frightening that it is. It almost borderlines on R-rated territory when it comes
it was scary.
Yeah.
Very violent.
Yeah, but you're right. The origin story aspect of that first Shazam was when it was at its most refreshing. The whole dynamic between Zachary Levi and Jack Dylan Grazer is great. Thankfully, there's a lot of that in the movie. So it gave me enough of an appreciation for it.
There's a lot more of that in the first film than the second film.
Well, we'll talk about that. That's a nice transition to talk about the second film, Shazam, Fury of the Gods, once again directed by David F. Sandberg. It stars Zachary Levi, of course, Asher Angel as young Billy Batson, although he's really in the movie for maybe a total of 5 minutes if you total up the screen time. It feels like more because he comes and goes from various scenes at different parts of the movie. So because he's in multiple scenes.
But for 30 seconds at a time. It's
exactly.
Crazy.
That's the thing. It's this weird illusion here. In fact, aside from Jack Dylan Grazer, who's also in this movie, you can almost say that about all of the kids returning from the first movie. Well, between Jack Dylan Grazer and Grace Carolyn Curry, she gets a lot of screen time too, and she's also very good. We'll talk about her too. So anyway, Jack Dylan Grazer also in this, Grace Carolyn Curry, as I mentioned, Adam Brody, Russ Butler, Megan Good, Jaimin Hunsu, Lucy Liu, and Helen Mirren. Apparently they're in this movie. Kind of forgot about that, but they're in this movie. Rachel Zegler making an appearance here after her star-making role in West Side Story. I think we'll talk about some of the interviews that she's been giving related to this. I don't know if you've seen some of those, Jay,
I have.
I think it's kind of emblematic of the film.
Yeah,
we'll talk about that. Anyway, the movie is about Shazam returning once again. It continues the story of teenage Billy Batson, who, upon reciting those words, is transformed into his adult superhero alter ego, but more battles and destruction in Philadelphia, of all places, ensues. So let's get into this, Jay. What did you think about Shazam, Fury of the Gods?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be quite as enthusiastic as the title wants me to be with the exclamation point there. This movie is dreadful. I mean, absolutely dreadful. There are few superhero movies that, to me, have lower human stakes to them. You mentioned the lack of Billy Batson in the movie. That was the emotional core of the first film was that we had to relate to the human beings. There are very little human beings in this movie. We are treated to 80% of the time, they're just the Shazam superhero characters. And there is no weight to those characters, not only because they aren't real quote unquote people, but also because there were no implications to the stuff that they're doing beyond the superhero acts that they're performing.
Yeah.
So all that we see them do is save a bridge or save people on a collapsing bridge or hang out in their little hideaway place where they don't really, for the most part, act like you mentioned it in the first film. Zachary Levi doesn't really act the way that Billy Batson is acting in that film. And I think that is ratcheted up to 100 in this movie. Zachary Levi has gone from kind of acting like a teenager to being just a total doofus. Like he's just
more like a 12-year-old or something.
Yes. I don't even know exactly how to describe it, but the only one who really I think is doing a good job of playing the age of the person who is inhabiting their body is Megan Good, who I think is quite good in the film.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah. I think she's very good, but the film just never relents and lets you understand the people behind the superheroes. It is so unrelenting in its desire to bring you into the world of those heroes and not to the real world. There is ever so slightly this plot line between what's his name, Brian Dylan Grazer, is that his name?
Jack Dylan Grazer, I think it is.
Jack Dylan Grazer
as Freddie Freeman.
He is the main kind of human character in this film.
He's kind of the star of the movie, actually.
Yes,
when you think about it.
Yeah. And he has this kind of budding romance with Rachel Zegler. And Rachel Zegler's plotline, you can see it coming from 6,000 miles away.
Well,
they telegraph it immediately.
It feels like a character that was written in with the overall agenda that, okay, this character is here is to serve one purpose. What famous upcoming actress can fill this role?
Yeah, kind of. It is a little bit of that Star is Born, here's a face that we can put on the poster kind of thing. And it all just leads to this film that feels to me totally weightless with just all that CGI noise that I loathe. And it's a lot of it looks bad. Lucy Liu riding around on a dragon looks bad. And speaking of Lucy Liu and Helen Mirren, talk about just nothing performances. I don't know what they could have done with this material, but they don't go big enough to really have fun, and they're kind of playing it just weirdly straight without any intonation whatsoever.
You have these are like I mean, with Helen Mirren at least, Shakespearean talent there. I mean, you're giving them literally underwritten characters. That's room to play with. And they don't
exactly. Yeah. Well, I think about Helen Mirren in the Fast and Furious movies. She has fun in those movies. She's good in those movies. And I know that Lucy Liu can be good in a movie like this too, but they are just I don't know if they were told to just play it flat, but they play it flat. And at the end of the day, this movie, I just couldn't wait for it to be over because it just does in the end just turn into a whole bunch of noise where they try to throw in these little bits of emotion that there's nothing before has led up to that. So it just feels totally weightless. Like I was saying, I think this movie is, thank God for Cocaine Bear for this movie, because otherwise I'd be calling it the worst movie of the year. But fortunately, I'll call it second worst.
That's high praise. Put that on the sticker. Second worst movie of the year. It's not the worst. Did you get the chance to watch Black Adam yet?
I have not watched Black Adam.
Okay.
I will confess.
Well, I was curious about that because something I said about Black Adam when JD and I reviewed that when that came out was how I called that my least favorite film in the entire DCEU, even though technically it wasn't the worst. I mean, a lot of those films that Zack Snyder did, or even that first Suicide Squad.
Oh, the Suicide Squad movie is brutal.
Yeah, but again, I would put those movies above a movie like Black Adam because at least those movies elicited some emotional response from me. It wasn't a good emotional response, but there are things about it that it at least tried, and I remembered. Black Adam, I forgot about minutes after leaving the theater.
Yeah.
And that's what made it worse. That's what made me hate it so much. I'm kind of feeling the same way about Shazam Fury of the Gods. Now,
100%.
I will say this at this point now. I know I like it more than a movie like Black Adam simply because there are times in the theater I was at least enjoying components of it. Like I did like Jack Dylan Grazer. I liked his chemistry with Rachel Zegler just because they're two talented actors that I feel like feed off of each other pretty well. And I like the idea that this character, Freddy, is bullied in school. And when he tries to confront this pretty girl, he actually openly acknowledges the silly things that most dorky kids say in movies. So I kind of like the self-awareness there that I thought was kind of cute in its own way. But aside from some of these things, like I find myself forgetting the movie as time goes on.
I saw it, 3-4 hours ago, and
You're already struggling?
Details are a little
They're
hazy.
blurry. They're blurry. And I think it just speaks to this overarching problem that we're kind of alluding to. And it is this transition between the DCEU into the DCU. And it's not that this movie is literally and narratively changing the scope of what this is. There is no like rebranding that actually happens that's meant to lead us into a new universe or a new timeline.
It's actually the exact opposite.
It is.
It is very grounded in the current DC universe.
Yeah, but
in one of the most shoehorned endings I can remember seeing.
And I feel like we need to talk
time.
about it. I mean, the trailers already gave it away. The TV spots have revealed it. So I guess it's not really a spoiler at this point. But it's the way that the film feels, because it feels like an obligation. It feels like a movie that had been planned, had been almost made in its own way, or at least like most of it had been written and made. And they need to release it in order to tie off this business bow of the DCEU.
Although I guess they don't, because they didn't release Batgirl. They don't have to. But
yeah. I mean, maybe they just assume that this had more monetary.
This had brand recognition behind it already.
It's a sequel to another film that worked for them, so I get the reasoning behind it. But I mean, the box office numbers, as we're talking about this now, they were not very good. But again, I think that's less on the film itself and more so due to timing. I mean, this is coming off, or this is being released after James Gunn already made this announcement. So people already have this knowledge. Why am I going to see this movie if I know it doesn't mean anything anymore? In
a world where fans are hyper aware of the business side of this stuff, I think that totally makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's what is happening here with regard to this film's box office. And I just think it's so forgettable, and I think that's the biggest sin a movie like this can commit. And it's not, I don't think it should be forgettable. There are moments in that final act that this should have felt like full-on Sam Raimi. It is ridiculous when you actually read it on paper, and then you've got probably the most egregious product placement since any Michael Bay film.
I was going to bring that up. It is insane, that product placement.
I mean, we're talking about Skittles.
And they say taste the rainbow twice, I believe.
The way that they're actually visualized is in slow motion, like it's meant to be seen for
it looks like a commercial.
And it's actually part of the plot. Like it's like you remove Skittles, the movie doesn't work. Like that's how important it is to this movie. It sort of reminded me of the Krispy Kreme in Power Rangers and how necessary it was to that movie. But that's exactly what it's doing. I kind of respect how brazen that it is. So it's kind of both a positive and a negative. But in many ways, it's my way of saying I wish the movie kind of embraced that brazenness even more, because at least it had some ounce of personality there.
You are right in that. To that Sam Raimi comparison, I think Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness had a lot more opportunities to lean into that, but at least there were like 3 scenes where you really felt the Sam Raimi.
I agree.
In this one, you kind of feel them ramping up to these horror-inspired moments when you have these monsters come into play, but they cut away before there's really a chance to kind of lean into the potential of that. The one moment that does kind of lean into that's very violent without being.
Are you talking about a scene on a rooftop?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Oh my God. Is that the most offensive thing in a superhero movie that's kind of aimed for kids?
It is crazy how they just brush that off.
Yeah.
I mean, it is so pushed to the side. And there's this, in the first film, they did a much better job of balancing that darkness with the levity of the Zachary Levi performance and that side of the film.
Agreed.
In this film, it's jarring. It could just oscillates back and forth between these tones that are very counter to each other. And not only is there the levity and then the really dark kind of horror stuff, there's also this super serious that people are playing so straight kind of story about gods and Zeus and Atlas and these Greek inspired, certainly from a design standpoint, and the performances are really trying to capture that mode that, again, just this give you this tonal whiplash where it never settles on what it really wants to be. And there's all this plot and all these different tones at the expense of characterization. We get almost the one kind of theme of this movie is this idea of all of us or none of us, where we all go into Shazam mode or none of us go into Shazam mode. Yeah. And they touch on it like 3 times over the course of the movie, and it is not enough to sustain an entire movie from a thematic or character standpoint. And so it just becomes all plot and MacGuffins and mythology, and it just is exhausting. I found this movie exhausting.
And literal Deus Ex Machinas, at least a few of them. One of them comes in the form of a shrugging pen that answers every question, which, again, I kind of appreciate the brazen nature of that convenience in the plot, but it's also kind of a problem because it's taking away from what worked about the first film, like you're talking about. The thing about the first film that I do love, despite not loving the film as a whole, I love the idea that it wasn't just a superhero movie that kids could enjoy. It was kind of made for kids. Like, it was about kids.
Except for those very horrific moments,
but even so, it didn't involve the specific scene that we're talking about in Shazam! Fury of the Gods, which is so unsettling, so disturbing, and so misguided that just because of that one scene, I don't think kids can see this movie. Or at least I would recommend they shouldn't.
I would say there's one other moment, too, involving Helen Mirren towards the end that's very graphic.
Yeah, that's a good point. I forgot about that. So I guess that's the moral here. Even something like that, I'm starting to forget about already. Another thing, too, you mentioned the overall look of this movie and just how Lucy Liu riding on a dragon does not look good. No. And part of that, too, is something we talk about with Marvel sometimes, or at least I've heard this criticism that they have this overly saturated look. And here's a movie that I think has the exact opposite problem. This is desaturated. Like this needed more
a lot of
color.
Browns.
It almost feels like it could have been a grayscale movie without actually becoming that. It's so pale and so blurry and so murky. It looks almost half finished if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I mean, all respect to David F. Sandberg, but I don't know that he's the most accomplished visual filmmaker working right now. Not that really even applies when it comes to these movies. A lot of times they're going for this house style. Right. And Sandberg is actually, you kind of mentioned the Rachel Zegler comments that she's had about this film. I don't know if you've seen the David F. Sandberg comments.
Yeah, what did it say? Something like, I got paid up front, so it's all good. I knew this was coming.
Yeah, they were talking about the bad box office, and Sandberg just said, yeah, saw this coming a mile away. I got paid up front, so what do I care? I don't know. I don't have any back end on this movie. And of course, which is just a crazy thing to say about a movie that he probably spent 2 years on. You know, for an artist to have spent 2 years making this artistic work, and then at this point just be like, yeah, clearly Warner Brothers has no interest in making this thing entirely successful or giving us the runway that we really needed to make this a great film. Yeah. And Rachel Zegler, which you brought up, basically said, I took this role because I needed a job and I hadn't really done anything since West Side Story. So
we kind of laugh and chuckle at that, but it's kind of sad when we actually say
it's
it
sad.
out loud. Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is.
It really is. It speaks to the fact that people don't care about this movie. They just don't care. Yeah. And it shows. Yeah, it shows really on the screen.
Yeah, it really does. And it's also like missed potential, because I think the ideas at play are not necessarily bad ideas. I think this film could have been visually elaborate and interesting and exciting. I think a lot of the actors here are obviously very talented in their own right. And there are aspects in the movie where I think it does work. Like I said, I really like Jack Dylan Grazer and his chemistry with Rachel Zegler. Of the transitional points between Shazam hero and their childlike counterpart, you're right that Megan Good, between Megan Good and Faith Herman, the two of them together are probably the best duality there. But I do think that Adam Brody and Jack Dylan Grazer kind of work together, and I think it's mostly because they just really look alike. Like they're the most doppelganger.
I just kind of like Adam Brody. I like Adam Brody.
I do too. I will say, I think, unlike the first film, I did sense at least a little bit more synergy between Zachary Levi and Asher Angel. And I think it's only because Asher Angel is hardly in this movie. So we have nothing to compare it to. So in many ways, if it works better, it's kind of an accident or for the wrong reasons. But yeah, it's a missed opportunity. I don't really have much else to say about this one. Do you have any final thoughts as we round out this conversation on Shazam! Fury of the Gods? Maybe what we think about how it's going to lead to the conclusion of this DCEU. Maybe we can, talk a little bit about the surprise cameo at the end. That's not a surprise anymore.
Let's get into spoilers a little bit here.
Okay. So
spoiler alert.
Yeah, so spoiler alert. But again, not really a spoiler, because the trailers or the TV spots already revealed that at some point in the movie, Gal Gadot shows up again as Wonder Woman in the most egregious convenience that I think I've seen in a superhero movie ever.
It is mind-numbingly stupid. So to be clear, we are speaking to, if you're beyond this point, we're talking spoilers now. You've probably seen the movie. We, of course, are talking about the fact that Shazam, a.k.a. Billy Batson, dies at Citizens Bank Park, of course. Some nice Philly synergy there.
Yeah. And
he is buried in the God realm, and then out of absolutely nowhere, you want to talk about a Deus Ex Machina. Holy cow. Wonder Woman shows up, says, I can reignite your magic staff, and just touch it on the ground, and flowers will bloom, and the tree will bloom, and then also this dead guy will become reanimated and reenact speaking of Raimi again, the Evil Dead hand out of the ground, or the Carrie hand out of the ground, and come back to life, and just, again, as always, treat everything with extraordinary levity. And it just is, I understand that they just won't let these people die, but oh my God, just let somebody die. Especially now, just let him die.
Well, I mean, given the fact that this is transitioning to something completely different soon, and given the kind of cruel nature of this movie, the way that it literally puts children in peril. I mean, the first film kind of did that too, but it felt more aware of that. This one kind of does it by accident, by putting literal children in peril. And in a lot of these cases, at least in the final act, they've lost their powers. So we have literal children running around powerless, riding on top of unicorns that were
throwing Skittles.
Yeah. So, but you have that, and then you have this that rooftop scene that we talked about earlier. That is one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen in a superhero movie. I feel like it would have been more fitting to just let Billy Batson die at the end, given all of that. So the fact that they don't commit to it, I mean, I get why they don't. I would have preferred if they did. I feel like
it was made. It was made assuming that this version of the universe would continue. So I understand that, but it just undercuts whatever dramatic tension they had established by the end, which for me was very little, but oh my God, at least there was something. At least there was something.
I agree.
And then they just completely undo it. And I mean, you're right. It is this, you think about it in the context of all these superhero movies where, you know, you don't want to leave people with this horrible sensation as they leave the theater. Mm-hmm. But also at the same time, you've shown a lot of like traumatic, gory stuff in this film, kind of disturbing stuff. So if there is a time to maybe take that risk, it's in a movie that has that stuff in it.
Yeah.
And then to have that connectivity, that tie to Wonder Woman I rolled my eyes in the movie theater. I was like,
it wasn't even just her appearance.
Out of here. Oh my God.
The way that her classic theme ramps up as if to really call attention to it. It felt like they were really just trying to bring these characters we've at least seen before in one final moment. But
remember how much you like Wonder Woman?
Just go watch Wonder Woman and Wonder Woman 1984. I'll die on that hill. I like that sequel quite a bit. At least it felt like a passionate film. And then, of course, there are 2 post-credit scenes. One of them, the second one that comes at the very end. I don't know if you stayed for the very end.
I couldn't do it. No.
It literally means nothing because it's not leading to anything. At least if I'm missing something. Maybe I just don't have enough knowledge.
What is it? Go ahead, and we're in spoiler territory.
Mark Strong comes back, and he's in a prison cell, and he's talking to a caterpillar that's meant to break him out, and then the caterpillar just walks away. That's basically all it is. But
cool.
There is a post-credit scene or a mid-credit scene specifically that I assume you at least stayed for.
No, I did not. I left right away.
Okay, well, that one at least felt kind of self-aware that a new universe is coming because it features Zachary Levi being recruited by members of Amanda Waller's Justice Society, not the Justice League or the Suicide Squad, but the Justice Society, which is represented in Black Adam. And they're asking him to join, and he's Zachary Levi as Shazam is saying like, why would you call it Justice Society? Like, shouldn't there be a rebranding or something like that? He literally comes out and says the words rebranding. So it does seem like there is maybe a literal self-awareness there that I couldn't tell if I liked or disliked. I kind of respected and hated it at the same time, which I guess is kind of emblematic of this whole film. I don't know. But yeah, I didn't care for it much. I'm liking it less even as we talk about it here.
It's terrible. I hated it with every fiber of my being. And I will say, just to add insult to injury, one of the greatest songs ever made, Naive Melody, This Must Be the Place by the Talking Heads. There is an egregiously bad cover of that song at one point. It plays for like 20 seconds. It pissed me off. It's when they go to the high school for the first time, and it's clearly trying to bring back memories of the 80s. It is
in a more modern way, but it's
so bad.
Yeah,
so bad.
Come on. Don't pick on David Byrne, man. You got to keep the essence alive. Keep the essence alive.
He was just at the Oscars.
Yes.
Which this movie will not be.
It will not be. It will not be. And I'm liking it less as we talk about here. I'm really curious to hear what you think about Black Adam if you ever choose to watch it. But
oh boy,
I'm not necessarily asking you to take the time to do so. I've
almost watched it 2 or 3 times, and I just haven't. Because I know it doesn't matter. I hear it as exactly what you're saying it is. Just a nothing of a movie. Just like this cynical exercise in trying to bring The Rock into the universe. And to me, The Rock has become one of my least favorite movie stars because he just makes rock movies. He refuses to give himself over to anything interesting.
At least other actors who are kind of in a similar, I guess, position, you know, some of these perceivably machismo actors that actually like came from a more machismo background, if you want to call it that, at least a lot of them have tried to challenge themselves. Like John Cena has tried to challenge himself a little bit and try and test his comedic chops a bit. So and a lot of them actually bring some charm, but I feel like Dwayne Johnson's sort of playing into the trope a bit too much. And it's a shame because I didn't love him in Black Adam either, and I usually like him in a lot of movies. So
I was a big fan until a few years ago, and I
Great in Pain and Gain.
Can't do it anymore.
But yeah, I guess this is all a way to say Shazam, Fury of the Gods. We're not a fan. We're not a fan.
We're saying don't Rachel Ziegler to the movie theater. Zagler away from it.
Well, there was some fury between us here. Anyway, if you heard what we had to say here and you agree or disagree with what we just said about Shazam, Fury of the Gods, you can let us know on social media, on Twitter, @InSessionFilm. That's the best way to get a hold of us there, or on Facebook, Instagram, all of those places. Or you can email us your thoughts in long form at InSessionFilm@gmail.com. I guess before we close things out here, Jay, one thing we didn't get a chance to do at the end of episode 526, the most recent main show that we did with you, myself, and Ryan McQuaid, talking about our top 5 movies about fatherhood, clearly inspired by our good friend JD Duran, who's taking his paternity leave now that Andrew has come into the world, and we're so happy for him and the entire Duran family. But that show ran a little long. We had a poll prepped, a poll around superhero comedies not from the MCU, so clearly inspired by Shazam, Fury of the Gods. I'm going to quickly get into some of those results now in a very unofficial capacity. It wasn't a very competitive poll, but I'll just say, in a category or in a poll category like this that includes Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, it didn't win. It usually wins these polls. The Incredibles won. The Incredibles,
good choice,
people think is the best superhero comedy. 31% there. In second place at 18%, actually close to 19%, Kick-Ass.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Kick-Ass. I don't know how you feel about that, but
I liked it at the time. I don't get the sense that I would like it if I watched it again.
That's how I am with it, but I understand why it would do well on a poll like this, because when you're talking about movies that are purely superhero comedies, that is kind of a blueprint for it, at least in the modern landscape of superhero movies. But anyway, with regard to some of these other options, Birds of Prey and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse were in third place at 12.5%. I will say some of these other films that at least got a few votes here that I really like. Mystery Men, I think, is a really interesting movie. The Mask, if you want to count that as a superhero movie. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the original from 1990, sort of a nostalgic favorite there, at least for many people.
Not enough Vanilla Ice for me.
Oh, fair enough. Fair enough. A movie that did not get any votes that I would love to throw some love to, if you want to call it a superhero film, Men in Black. The original Men in Black, I think, is a very good one.
Yeah, I mean, Incredibles is the choice here. I think that is, I maintain that is the best superhero movie, period. Strip away any qualifiers. That's my favorite superhero movie, so obviously I would have voted for it here. Yeah,
I probably would have voted for it as well, but I do love a lot of those other films, just to throw some love to some underappreciated superhero comedies. But we thank everyone that voted on the poll, and for those of you listening, we thank you for joining us. Once again, we'll plug episode 526, where we talked about our top 5 movies about fatherhood. But be on the lookout for episode 527 coming up next weekend. It's going to be inspired by John Wick Chapter 4, so it's going to be action films galore. We might be talking about best action sequences, action movie stars. At this point now, I don't want to speak too soon, Jay. Kind of leaning towards best action sequences.
I think that'd be a lot of fun.
I think so too. I'll have to double check the archives to see if we haven't done it yet, which I wouldn't be surprised if we did. But I do think, given the topic at hand, John Wick Chapter 4, which is known for its inventive action sequences, it only makes sense. I think it only makes sense.
I would love to do that. Absolutely. I put it on the spreadsheet.
You did, so you're biased towards it. But anyway, be on the lookout for that next week. Thanks again for listening, everyone. We will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast.
We're like Fury of podcasters.
Are you calling ourselves gods now?